In a world of endless deserts and distant cities, a young traveler carries a small charm that could change his destiny. Silk, secrets, and unseen dangers await on the journey ahead. Under the dim glow of the oil lamps, when the stars above the yellow river plain were veiled in a pale mist and the distant croak of night frogs wove itself into the rhythm of sleep, an old storyteller in Luoyang would begin his tale with the same phrase. Every great journey begins with a sound too small to notice. He spoke of the faint rustle of silkworms chewing mulberry leaves, a whisper so delicate that it could not stir the stillness of the night, yet from those small jaws came threads that would one day wrap emperors and lure caravans across deserts. It was the 2nd century before our era, when the Han dynasty stretched its long arm across valleys and mountains, uniting lands fractured by war. The empire was strong, but still fragile, stitched together by ambition and roads of packed earth. In the town of Chengdu, far to the west where the air smelled of pine resin and pepper, a young boy named Liang helped his grandmother tend to mulberry trees. He was no different from the other children of the market quarter. His bare feet hardened by the dust of alleys, his belly often grumbling for food after long days. But Liang carried in his hands something the soldiers on the frontier would never see, the threads of silk that his grandmother reeled with patient fingers. At night, when the lanterns flickered low, he would watch her guide the cocoon through steaming water, pulling out a single line that gleamed like captured sunlight. The thread never seemed to end, unraveling with a grace that made Liang think of rivers spilling endlessly toward the sea. His grandmother, her back bent like a bow and her voice soft as warm rice, would tell him that this thread was more valuable than gold, though only nobles and merchants knew its true worth. For Liang, it was just another part of their daily survival, a task as ordinary as grinding millet or fetching water. Yet beyond their town, beyond the ridges that rose like green waves in the west, men were beginning to whisper of distant lands where people dreamed of silk, lands so far that no farmer had seen them, only traders with weathered faces and sand in their hair. And so, the rustle of silkworms in Chengdu became the first note in a symphony that would stretch across continents. Life in those days moved slowly, marked not by hours but by seasons. In spring, the mulberries sprouted tender green leaves, and Liang's fingers turned sticky with sap as he plucked them for the worms. In summer, when the air smelled of wet earth and the river swelled with rain, the silk reels spun endlessly, the sound like a chorus of soft sighs. Autumn brought festivals, with drums echoing through the streets and lanterns floating on the water like fireflies caught in dreams. Liang loved those nights most, when roasted chestnuts crackled on braziers, and sweet rice cakes dusted with sesame perfumed the air. He would clutch one in his hand, feeling its warmth seep through the cool night, while the elders sang old songs about warriors and spirits. Winter, however, was harder. The silkworms slept, the mulberry trees stood bare, and hunger sharpened its teeth. People wrapped themselves in coarse hemp, their breath rising in mist as they huddled by small fires. Yet even then, stories of silk carried warmth. Merchants from the east told of nobles who draped themselves in flowing robes that shimmered like morning dew, and Liang, though wrapped in patched cloth, would dream of such splendor. Still, splendor felt far away. What Liang knew most intimately was the market, the smell of fish drying in the sun, the shouts of women haggling over ginger, the smoke of pork fat sizzling on skewers. His grandmother sold small skeins of silk thread there, tucked carefully into bamboo cases. Sometimes she received coins, other times bundles of grain or dried herbs. Once, a traveling physician offered her a pouch of bitter powder that could ease her aching knees, and Liang watched as she bowed deeply in thanks. It was in that market that Liang first saw the camel. The animal stood taller than any ox, its neck arching like the curve of a lute, its eyes dark and patient. Its driver wore a tunic of unfamiliar cut, and his language was thick with strange sounds. Children swarmed to see the beast, its humps swaying as it shifted weight. The air smelled suddenly of foreign spices, sharp and sweet, and Liang's heart thudded in wonder. That camel, and the man who led it, would become a sign of how wide the world truly was. For soon, caravans would begin their long paths westward, carrying silk through deserts where the wind howled like wolves, across mountains that stabbed at the sky. But on that evening, Liang only stared, his chest swelling with curiosity he could not name. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, his grandmother told him of Zhong Qian, a man sent by the emperor to journey beyond the western mountains. She spoke of how Zhong had crossed treacherous lands, been captured, escaped, and finally returned with tales of great kingdoms beyond the horizon. Because of him, she said, her hands folded over her lap, our silk will travel where our eyes cannot. And perhaps one day, Liang, you too will see the deserts and the rivers he saw. Liang did not know whether to believe her, but the idea settled in his mind like a seed in dark soil. The years that followed did not spare him hardship. His grandmother grew frilier, her hands trembling as she worked the reels. Liang took on more of the burden, waking before dawn to chop wood, haul water, and tend the worms. He learned to cook millet porridge that smelled faintly of smoke, to patch shoes with leather scraps, to listen to the gossip of market women who always seemed to know when soldiers would march or taxes would rise. Yet even as routine pressed down on him, he noticed more strangers passing through town. Their faces were different, their clothes cut in odd patterns, their saddlebags filled with things he could not name. Once, he caught the scent of cinnamon on the wind, sweet and sharp, and it clung to his memory for weeks. These travelers spoke of far-off places where the air burned with heat or froze with snow, where seas stretched farther than 1,000 rivers, where people wore cloaks of wool and ate bread instead of rice. Liang listened with wide eyes, and though he still washed silkworm trays and scrubbed rice pots, he began to dream of roads that stretched beyond his town. One autumn, when the chrysanthemums had just begun to bloom and their fragrance lingered like honey in the air, a trader from Dunhuang stopped at the market. He noticed the fine silk Liang's grandmother had spun, smoother than most, and he paid with silver coins that gleamed like captured moonlight. 4 days afterward, Liang could not stop staring at them, the way they chimed softly when struck together, the weight they carried in his palm. The coins felt like a promise of something larger, something waiting beyond the walls of his town. Yet promises often come with shadows. Along with merchants came thieves, men with quick hands and quicker tempers. Taxes grew heavier, soldiers more demanding. The people of Chengdu grumbled as they tightened belts and patched roofs. Liang saw his grandmother skip meals so he could eat, her thin frame bent over the fire, her face drawn with lines of fatigue. He hated the unfairness of it, hated the soldiers who rode through as though the town were theirs to plunder. But at night, when the silkworms rustled and the moon shone silver on the river, he felt the thread of hope still. The sun rose slowly over the eastern horizon, casting a pale, gold-tinged light across the terraced fields and narrow, winding streets of Chengdu, and Liang felt the familiar ache in his limbs from yesterday's labor. The scent of wet earth mingled with the faint sweetness of mulberry leaves, and a soft mist clung to the rooftops, curling like smoke from unseen fires. Today, however, the air carried something different, a tension that made the marketplace hum with whispered speculation. Word had arrived that a new caravan from the western regions was approaching, heavier and more elaborate than any the townspeople had seen in memory, bringing goods from lands that seemed like dreams, horses with coats like polished bronze, spices that burned and lingered, and, most coveted of all, silk dyed in hues the eye struggled to name. Liang, barely 15 but with hands calloused from constant toil, followed his grandmother through the morning bustle, their baskets clinking with threads of pale yellow, green, and ivory. She moved with a measured grace, nodding to neighbors and traders, yet her eyes flickered constantly toward the horizon, as if she too sensed that the day would not pass like any other. When they reached the center of town, a crowd had gathered, forming a rough semicircle around a group of men unloading the caravan. Camels shifted their weight with a creaking of leather and the hollow echo of wood, and the traders' voices rose in the clamor of counting coins, arranging bales, and haggling over the value of foreign goods. Liang pressed forward, curiosity pulling him into the center of the swirl. He watched as a bundle of deep blue silk, so dark it seemed almost black in the morning light, was unfurled and displayed to a group of wide-eyed merchants. The edges of the cloth shimmered as if a hidden river flowed beneath the surface, and Liang's breath caught. He could not explain why, but he felt as if the cloth were calling him, as though it contained stories he was meant to witness. Among the traders, an older man with a sun-darkened face and hands rough from years of travel caught sight of Liang. He bent slightly, as though acknowledging something unseen, and whispered words in a dialect that the boy only half understood. Liang felt a shiver pass through him, a mix of fear and anticipation. His grandmother, noticing his hesitation, pressed a hand to his shoulder. "Patience," she murmured. "There is more than sight here. Watch and learn." Days turned into weeks, and Liang found himself drawn into the rhythm of the caravan's preparations. The traders would leave at dawn, the camels loaded with bales of silk, jars of saffron, and precious stones, and move steadily westward, disappearing over the hills like shadows in flight. Liang, desperate to glimpse the world beyond his small town, began to follow them at a distance, trailing the caravan through narrow valleys and along rivers whose waters glinted silver in the morning sun. He slept under pine trees, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, listening to the soft snore of the camels and the distant howls of wolves. He tasted new foods along the way, dried apricots that stuck sweetly to his teeth, flatbreads baked on hot stones, and roasted chestnuts whose smoky aroma lingered long after the fire had died down. In the quiet moments, Liang would pull from his satchel small strands of silk his grandmother had given him, rubbing them between his fingers and marveling at the texture, soft yet resilient, a tangible piece of home he carried across unknown lands. The caravan's path led through mountain passes that seemed carved from jade and stone, and Liang learned quickly to read the signs of the landscape, the shift of wind before a storm, the sudden call of an eagle that warned of danger, the subtle footprints of other travelers who had passed through days or weeks before. In the evenings, when the campfires flickered and the cold air settled into their bones, the traders would tell stories of distant kingdoms, of towering walls built to touch the clouds, of markets where gold flowed like water, of kings who commanded entire armies with a single word. Liang listened with wide eyes, feeling the pull of worlds he had only glimpsed in the dreams that came with sleep. And yet, not all the travelers were kind. Along the route, bandits lurked in shaded passes, waiting for the unwary. Liang witnessed a merchant have his pack torn from his camel by men masked with soot and rage, the air thick with shouts and the tang of iron. Fear became as constant a companion as the road itself, and Liang learned to move quietly, to keep his hands close to the folds of his own possessions, to trust only those whose eyes he had seen in honest light. The caravan slowed near desert outposts, towns built of sun-baked clay and bustling with merchants who had crossed sands from countless horizons. Liang marveled at the diversity of faces and customs, the calligraphy painted in black ink on parchment, the sound of lutes strummed with fingers that moved like dancing shadows, the smell of incense burning alongside roasted meats. Here he discovered how silk was not merely cloth, but a language, a symbol of wealth and diplomacy, carried as gifts for kings and generals. He watched as traders measured pieces carefully, wrapping them in thin paper, and handing them with reverence to men on horseback, their eyes sharp and calculating. Liang felt a mixture of awe and longing, a tug at his heart that made the miles behind him feel both impossibly far and yet entirely reachable. Nights brought reflection. Under the wide expanse of stars, the caravan camped on hillsides where the wind carried the scent of wild thyme and distant pines. Liang lay on his back, staring upward, imagining each star as a city he might one day visit. He thought of his grandmother, tending the mulberries, and felt a pang of homesickness so sharp that tears burned the edges of his eyes. Yet he also knew that every step forward was a thread in the tapestry of his life, a connection to people and lands beyond the horizon. As the caravan pushed into the deserts, the earth turned from fertile soil to endless stretches of sand that rose and fell like waves. The sun scorched their backs, and water became a precious treasure measured in small, careful sips. Liang learned the taste of thirst, the grit of sand in his mouth, and the relief of finding an oasis, where palm trees bowed over pools that mirrored the sky. He saw mirages shimmer in the heat, city-like illusions that vanished as he approached, and with each disappointment, he learned patience, resilience, and the strange beauty of the barren expanse. Along the road, the cultures he encountered intertwined in ways he had never imagined. Caravanserais welcomed travelers of every tongue, their walls alive with murals depicting gods and heroes from lands Liang had only heard about. Food, music, and stories blended. Spiced meat braised in clay pots alongside steamed dumplings, songs in unfamiliar scales echoing with the lilt of Mandarin, Sogdian, and the distant cadence of Persian. Liang absorbed it all, feeling the borders between peoples blur in the soft hum of shared humanity. Yet danger was never far. A sudden sandstorm could swallow the caravan, a dispute over payment could erupt in violence, and illness travelled silently along the trail, taking men with a fevered cough or swollen belly. Liang witnessed the fragility of life, the way fortune could turn in a single heartbeat. Once, a merchant companion collapsed in the heat, and Liang, guided by instinct, fetched water, fanned the man, and pressed cool cloths to his skin until he breathed steadily again. That night, the trader's gratitude etched itself into Liang's mind, a lesson in compassion and the delicate balance of survival. As they approached the frontier of the western kingdoms, the mountains loomed taller, jagged as broken teeth against the sky. The air grew thin and crisp, and Liang felt the first chill of altitude biting at his lungs. He watched as camels navigated narrow ledges, their hooves sure on the uneven stone, their bells chiming a metallic song against the silence of the peaks. From this height, he could see valleys stretching endlessly below, rivers snaking like silver threads, villages dotting the landscape like scattered seeds. In one of these valleys, a small town welcomed the caravan, its streets lined with merchants eager for the exotic silk, its taverns smoky and alive with conversation in tongues Liang struggled to follow. Here, Liang first saw the interplay of politics and trade, the way local governors met with traders to negotiate taxes, the subtle gestures exchanged with bowed heads and careful words. He realized that the silk he carried was not mere fabric, but a key to alliances, a tool that could sway kings and generals, a thread connecting empires. Liang's own understanding of the world deepened, and he felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his young shoulders. One evening, as the sun sank behind the western ridges and the air cooled with a faint whisper of winter, Liang wandered to the edge of town and watched the river flow beneath the last light. The water mirrored the sky's fading colors, streaks of rose and lavender mixing with deepening indigo. He imagined the river carrying his silk, not as a commodity but as a story, a bridge across cultures, a path from his home to lands he had never seen. In the quiet of that twilight, a traveller approached him, wrapped in a cloak that smelled of distant deserts and candle wax. The man's eyes were sharp, and he spoke in measured tones that carried a foreign rhythm. He inquired about Liang's work with silk, about the quality of the threads, and about the boy's journey from Chengdu. Liang, cautious yet emboldened by months of travel, answered truthfully, describing the mulberry groves, his grandmother's hands, the feel of the threads between his fingers. The traveller listened with an intensity that made Liang's pulse quicken, and when he finally nodded, he handed Liang a small charm carved from jade, smooth and cool, inscribed with symbols that Liang could not yet read. "Keep this," the traveller said. "It will guide you when the road grows dark." Liang clutched the charm in his palm, feeling its weight, and a strange warmth spread through him. That night, as the campfires burned low and the wind carried whispers from distant peaks, he realized that the journey had changed him irrevocably. He was no longer the boy who tended mulberries, who measured life in small hours and simple meals. He had become part of a larger tapestry, a thread stretching across deserts and mountains, carrying dreams, stories, and silk to places unseen. And yet, as he drifted into sleep beneath the expanse of stars, a sense of unease lingered, a shadow at the edge of wonder. For rumors had reached the caravan of rival traders, of bandits organized in distant passes, of kingdoms suspicious of outsiders bearing riches unknown. The charm in Liang's hand seemed to pulse faintly, as if warning him of challenges yet to come. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the first whispers of danger stirred, like a storm gathering strength in the mountains. Liang slept, unaware of what lay ahead, but the threads of his life, the silk of his homeland, and the paths of empires were already weaving together, destined to pull him into trials that would test courage, loyalty, and the quiet persistence of the human spirit. And as dawn broke, painting the sky in pale gold and crimson, the caravan prepared to depart once more, camels shifting, bells tinkling, dust rising in clouds that caught the first light. Liang, jade charm in hand, silk strapped to his back, felt the pull of the road, the vastness of the lands stretching westward, and a thrill of anticipation mingled with fear. Somewhere beyond the next mountain pass, beyond the river that curved like a serpent through unknown valleys, a new chapter awaited, a chapter that would carry him further than he had ever imagined, and reveal that the small rustle of silkworms in Chengdu had set in motion events reaching across kingdoms and empires, through deserts and mountains, binding people and destinies in ways yet unseen. And so, with the caravan moving forward, leaving clouds of dust in its wake, Liang stepped onto the path, unaware that the first glimmer of great adventure and great peril had already begun to stir in the wind, whispering promises and warnings alike, pulling him inexorably toward the horizon where the unknown awaited, vast, beautiful, and dangerous, ready to test the threads of silk and the strength of his spirit in ways that would echo for years to come. The caravan moved steadily westward, the rhythm of camel hooves striking the hard-packed earth like a distant drumbeat that marked the passing of time, and Liang began to understand that the journey was as much about endurance as it was about discovery. The sun rose fiercely each morning, painting the desert sand in shades of gold and copper, and at night the stars stretched endlessly above, as if inviting him into the vastness of a world that seemed both beautiful and indifferent. Liang learned to measure distance not by the sun's path, but by the subtle shifts in the wind, the texture of sand beneath his feet, and the behavior of the camels that had become both companions and guides. In one village along the way, he marveled at an open-air market where spices hung in woven baskets, their aromas mingling, cumin, saffron, dried citrus peel, and powdered ginger, to create a scent that seemed to sing of foreign lands. The traders laughed and shouted in voices mingling Persian, Sogdian, and Mandarin, and Liang felt the hum of humanity vibrating in every gesture, every exchange. Nights at the caravan's camp were a mixture of quiet reflection and cautious vigilance. Liang learned the subtle signals of the desert, the way a camel's ears twitched, the scent carried on the wind, the sudden hush among the traders when distant howls suggested predators. He discovered the taste of hunger and the relief of finding water at the last moment, the joy of simple meals cooked over open flames, flatbread warmed on stones, dried meat softened in broth, and the rare sweetness of dates that stuck to his teeth. Each night, as he lay on his blanket under the star-strewn sky, he thought of Chengdu, of his grandmother's hands and the gentle rustle of silkworms, and he felt the threads of home stretching across the miles, anchoring him even as the road carried him farther into the unknown. As they approached the first great mountain pass, Liang saw the world change before his eyes. The soft, undulating hills gave way to jagged cliffs, their faces carved into sharp ridges that cut across the sky. The wind was colder here, carrying the scent of pine resin and snow that lingered in shaded crevices. The camels moved carefully along narrow paths, their hooves finding purchase in stones slick with frost. Liang learned to steady his breath, to step lightly, and to read the mountain in the same way he had read the silk threads at home, with patience, attention, and reverence. In one encampment at the base of the mountains, Liang encountered a trader from the west, who spoke of lands beyond the horizon where silk was traded not only for silver but for horses, weapons, and even promises of alliances. The man's eyes gleamed with knowledge and ambition, and he spoke of deserts filled with shifting sands, of cities that rose like mirages, and of kingdoms that viewed each other with suspicion and awe. Liang absorbed every word, imagining himself walking the streets of these distant cities, imagining the colors of their markets, the rhythm of their music, and the taste of their food. The mountains demanded respect and vigilance. During one night in a narrow pass, a sudden rock slide thundered down the cliffside, sending stones crashing to the path below. Camels brayed in alarm, traders shouted, and Liang scrambled to help a younger camel whose leg had been caught. Sweat stung his eyes, dust choked his throat, but he managed to free the animal, guided it to safer ground, and felt a surge of pride mixed with fear. The mountains were beautiful, but their beauty carried danger, reminding Liang that the world beyond his town was neither tame nor predictable. As the caravan descended into a broad valley beyond the mountains, the air shifted again, warmer now, scented with the resin of cedar and the faint tang of distant rivers. Here, Liang saw the first signs of civilizations that seemed almost mythical, towns with clay walls painted in ochre, roofs that gleamed in the sun with tiles glazed blue, and the smoke of cooking fires rising in steady columns from hundreds of chimneys. Merchants of many origins congregated in the marketplaces, exchanging silk, jade, and spices. Liang watched as local families bartered, their children running barefoot between stalls, laughing and dodging animals. He noticed the intricate patterns woven into fabrics, the way the colors shifted with the light, and he understood that every piece of cloth carried not only wealth but culture, identity, and artistry. In one bustling inn, Liang tasted food that bewildered and delighted him: dumplings stuffed with seasoned meat, flatbreads layered with honey and nuts, and fragrant teas brewed from herbs he had never seen before. He listened to stories of travelers from as far as the Caspian Sea and India, each tale more astonishing than the last, and he felt a mixture of awe and a longing so sharp it made his chest ache. Yet even amidst wonder, the journey carried hardship. Bandits still lurked along the passes, and illness could strike with cruel suddenness. Liang witnessed a trader fall ill to a fever that racked his body, the man's breath shallow, eyes glassy. Liang, guided by instinct and the lessons of home, helped care for him, fetching water, tending the fire, and offering comfort where he could. The trader survived, and the gratitude he showed taught Liang a deeper lesson, that courage and kindness were threads as essential to the journey as silk itself. Along the rivers that cut through fertile valleys, the caravan slowed to rest, allowing camels to drink and traders to barter. Liang wandered among the villages, noting how cultures met and blended. Markets filled with Persian carpets alongside Chinese porcelain, songs sung in foreign tongues alongside local melodies, and dishes that fused flavors from dozens of lands. He learned to identify the subtle signs of wealth and influence, the way a merchant's robe was cut, the gleam of rings on fingers, the careful measure of coins exchanged. Liang began to understand that trade was more than exchange. It was diplomacy, strategy, and survival, all woven together like the silk he carried. Nights under the stars grew long and reflective. Liang often found a quiet spot near the fire or by the riverbank to sit and examine his charm, the jade warm against his palm. He traced its carvings, wondered about its origins, and felt the pull of destiny in its smooth edges. He realized that while the journey had started with silk and curiosity, it was now also a journey of understanding, of measuring courage, patience, and perception. With each passing day, he felt the weight of responsibility grow, not just for the silk, but for the lives intertwined with the caravan, traders, travelers, camels, and fellow dreamers like himself. And yet, as the valley opened to the desert plains beyond, a sense of unease began to creep into the edges of his consciousness. Whispers among the traders spoke of rival caravans, of raiders more organized and ruthless than any they had encountered, of kingdoms suspicious of foreigners bearing riches they did not fully understand. Liang sensed that the charms, the silk, and even his own skills might soon be tested in ways that went beyond physical endurance, that would demand ingenuity, courage, and perhaps even sacrifice. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of red and orange, Liang stood at the edge of the desert, the camels silhouetted behind him. The wind carried the scent of hot sand and distant spices, the sound of merchants calling out last-minute deals, and the faint echo of music from a nearby inn. The jade charm in his hand seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as though responding to the vastness before him. Liang's heart quickened, a mixture of anticipation and fear tightening in his chest. The path ahead was uncertain, stretching across deserts that could swallow travelers whole and lands that promised both marvel and peril. As the night fell, the first stars appeared, pale and distant, yet luminous against the deepening indigo sky. Liang felt the threads of his life stretching outward, connecting him to people and places he had yet to see. The desert whispered of trials, of encounters that would shape his understanding of the world, and of the resilience required to carry not only silk but the hopes and fears of those he represented. Somewhere in the shadows of the dunes, unknown eyes watched the caravan, evaluating, calculating, waiting for the moment to strike. Liang could not see them, but a chill passed over him none the less, a premonition of challenges that would test his courage and cunning. And as the firelight flickered against his face, casting long, wavering shadows, he realized that the adventure he had longed for had truly begun. The journey west was no longer a dream. It was a crucible, and he would need every ounce of patience, skill, and heart to navigate the lands ahead. The silk threads in his hands shimmered faintly in the firelight, a tangible link to his grandmother, to Chengdu, and to the humble beginnings that had set him on this road. Yet the horizon stretched infinitely, the desert wind carrying secrets and dangers, and Liang knew that the path forward would demand more than strength. It would demand the wisdom to see what was hidden, the courage to face what was feared, and the grace to hold hope even when the sand seemed endless. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the first stirrings of destiny awaited, as inevitable and mysterious as the stars above, pulling Liang toward challenges that would shape not only his own life but the connections between kingdoms, traders, and peoples across continents. The caravan prepared to leave with the dawn, camels shifting restlessly, bells jingling softly, and the air carrying a tension that was palpable yet electric. Liang, jade charm in hand, silk strapped to his back, felt the weight of possibility and peril entwined, aware that every step forward was a step into the unknown. The desert awaited, vast and silent, holding secrets, trials, and encounters that would forever alter the boy from Chengdu, the humble silk maker, transforming him into someone who would walk paths few had ever seen, and whose story would one day be whispered under lamps and stars far from the place where it began. The first true challenge was approaching, though its form remained unseen, like a shadow at the edge of a flame, waiting for the right moment to step into the light, and Liang, standing at the cusp of sand and sky, felt both fear and exhilaration coiling in his chest, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The desert stretched endlessly before the caravan, a shifting sea of gold and ochre, and Liang felt the heat rising from the sand, curling around his legs and climbing into his chest like a living thing. The wind carried grit and whispers of distant dunes, and he could see the mirages waver in the shimmering heat, cities that seemed to appear and vanish with every step. Camels plodded steadily, their bells jingling a soft rhythm against the silence of the vast expanse, and traders murmured in low voices, speaking of routes, hazards, and the possibility of bandits lurking in the shadows of the dunes. Liang kept the jade charm in his palm, smooth and cool despite the scorching sun, as if it absorbed some of the desert's heat and reminded him of home, of his grandmother's hands and the gentle rustle of silkworms in Chengdu. Days passed in this measured, grueling pace. Liang learned to ration water, taking small sips that lingered in his mouth, savoring the relief that followed. He tasted the occasional dates offered by fellow travelers, their sweetness a small pleasure that cut through the monotony of sand and wind. At night, when the stars opened like a vast map above, he felt both insignificant and infinite, a tiny thread in a tapestry that stretched across the continents. Along the way, the caravan stopped at oases, pools of water shimmering like glass amid clusters of date palms. Liang marveled at the life that clung stubbornly to these desert refuges. Birds dipped into the water, lizards darted over sun-baked rocks, and the faint scent of blooming desert flowers mingled with the dryness of the sand. Merchants from different lands congregated here as well, sharing news, food, and stories. Liang noticed how cultures collided and blended. A Persian trader would trade saffron for Chinese silk, while a local nomad would offer camel milk in exchange for fabrics dyed in blue and gold. Music drifted across the evening air, a mingling of strings and flutes, with rhythms that were unfamiliar yet strangely familiar, echoing in Liang's heart like a melody half-remembered. Yet the desert was not without peril. One afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the sky, and a sudden sandstorm descended upon the caravan, swallowing sight and sound in a choking, swirling fury. Liang clung to the camel in front of him, feeling the coarse hair bite against his arms, the sand slicing at exposed skin. The traders shouted commands, calling names, trying to maintain order as the storm tore through their line, and for a long, tense hour, the caravan became a single, struggling organism against the wind's assault. When the storm finally passed, the desert lay quiet once more, a pale, trembling expanse under the waning sun. Liang wiped sand from his eyes and mouth, heart hammering, and he realized how fragile their progress was, how quickly the desert could turn from a path of wonder to a crucible of survival. At night, they camped under the stars, their fires small against the vast darkness. Liang lay awake, listening to the whispers of wind through palm fronds and the distant calls of desert creatures, pondering the road ahead. The jade charm seemed to pulse softly against his palm, a reminder that he was not alone, that unseen forces, both protective and perilous, moved around him. The journey westward was teaching him more than geography or trade. It was teaching patience, observation, and the quiet resilience needed to navigate a world that offered both marvel and danger. In one small desert settlement, Liang observed a festival being held in honor of a visiting dignitary. The streets were decorated with colored cloths, lanterns swinging gently in the breeze, and the aroma of roasted meats, spiced breads, and sweet pastries mingled with the dry desert air. Children ran between stalls, laughing, their bare feet stirring up dust, while musicians played lutes and drums, their melodies a mixture of foreign and familiar scales. Liang tasted a pastry filled with dates and honey, the sweetness melting against his tongue, and he realized that even in the harshest landscapes, human creativity and joy persisted, bridging cultures and histories. But shadows lingered. Traders spoke in hushed tones of rival caravans, of brigands who had learned the desert paths, of local authorities who might intervene if wealth changed hands too visibly. Liang sensed that danger was not only physical but political, a tension that required cleverness and caution to navigate. The next morning, the caravan set out before dawn, moving quietly to avoid attracting attention. Liang walked alongside the camels, feeling the rhythmic sway of their bodies as the desert stretched endlessly around him. He reflected on how far he had come, from the mulberry groves of Chengdu to this vast alien landscape, carrying silk that could change fortunes and fates. He thought of the people whose lives intersected with his grandmother, whose teachings and threads had started this journey, the merchants who guided and protected him, and the countless strangers whose paths crossed with his own, leaving subtle marks that would influence his understanding of the world. As the sun climbed higher, the desert shimmered with heat, and Liang spotted movement on a distant ridge. A small group of riders, their faces obscured by cloth, watched the caravan. Heart pounding, Liang felt the weight of anticipation and fear. He tightened his grip on the jade charm, its surface warm and grounding, and instinctively understood that these figures were not mere travelers. They were a sign that the challenges ahead were growing more immediate and personal. The caravan slowed, the traders exchanging quick, urgent words, and Liang realized that the path ahead would demand all the skills, courage, and wisdom he had gathered since leaving Chengdu. The desert, beautiful and merciless, had become a teacher, and Liang's lessons were far from complete. He understood that the silk he carried was more than fabric. It was a key to survival, to negotiation, and to influence across distant lands. And as the riders drew closer, the wind carrying the faint clatter of hooves, Liang felt the first true pulse of danger in the journey west, a test not of endurance alone but of perception, courage, and the delicate art of reading friend from foe in a world as vast and shifting as the desert sands themselves. The caravan prepared to respond, their movements synchronized, camels guided carefully to positions of advantage, traders standing ready to protect their goods and companions. Liang, heart racing, felt the tension coiling in the air, the promise of adventure now intertwined with the stark reality of peril. And as the riders approached the crest of the ridge, the desert's heat radiating in waves across the sand, Liang's gaze remained fixed on the jade charm, on the silk tied to his back, and on the horizon that stretched endlessly before him, vast, beautiful, and dangerous, knowing that the true trial of the journey, the one that would test not only his skill and courage but the very essence of his spirit, was about to unfold. The riders emerged from the ridge with a sudden, almost fluid precision, their intentions unclear but unmistakably tense, and Liang felt the pulse of danger quicken in his chest, the jade charm warm against his palm as if lending him courage. The caravan tightened, traders forming a protective line around the camels and goods, voices low but firm in commands, each movement deliberate, every glance calculated. Liang's heart beat in sync with the desert wind, the rhythm of hooves, and the subtle shifting of sand beneath their feet, all coalescing into a singular awareness of the moment. As the riders approached, one dismounted, hands raised, speaking in a tongue that was foreign yet not entirely incomprehensible, gestures carefully measured, signaling negotiation rather than conflict. Liang, guided by instinct and months of observation, stepped forward slightly, showing the charm and silk, demonstrating respect and transparency, and the tension hung like a drawn bowstring, ready to snap. Moments stretched, the heat shimmering above the sand, the air thick with anticipation, until slowly the rider's posture relaxed, the leader nodding once with understanding, and a fragile accord formed. Relief washed over the caravan in quiet waves, the camels shifting, the traders exhaling, and Liang felt a profound mixture of exhaustion, exhilaration, and gratitude. That night, as the desert sky glittered with stars and campfires cast soft, flickering light, the travelers shared food, laughter, and stories of the day, a communal heartbeat against the vast, indifferent expanse around them. Liang held the jade charm in his hand, tracing its carved edges, feeling the journey etched into his very being, the lessons of patience, courage, empathy, and resilience, and understood that the silk threads he carried were not merely trade, but symbols of connection, trust, and the indomitable human spirit. With dawn, the caravan resumed its westward path, the horizon stretching like an open promise, and Liang, eyes fixed on the endless sands ahead, felt the quiet certainty that this journey, with its trials and revelations, had transformed him forever, leaving him ready for whatever lay beyond the next dune, the next horizon, where adventure, challenge, and discovery awaited in equal measure.